Well, welcome to Canada, User's Guide and Owner's Manual, Episode 2. Honk, honk, when Canadians fight for freedom, we always win. My name is Randy Hillier. I've been opposing government for 25 years now, first as an activist, and then for 15 years in the Ontario Parliament. Many of you will know that I was the first elected representative in Canada to oppose the COVID mandates and the state of emergency. And during these past 25 years, it's become painfully obvious to me that many Canadians have very little knowledge or understanding of our rich and colorful history of protests and rebellions. Indeed, I would say many Canadians know American history better than our own. And that's for a few different reasons. One, of course, would be that we live right beside the largest economy in the world, the United States. But I think there's also a purposeful and willfulness on the part of our public education system and our governments to downplay this colorful history of protest and rebellion and to convince Canadians that we've always been a passive, obedient, and compliant culture, and that we'd be better off if we just listened to government rather than remember our culture of rebellions and protests. COVID wasn't the first time that our governments conspired with corporate interests to exploit Canadians and to diminish our freedoms. Indeed, I would say it's not going to be the last time either. But it's pretty obvious to me and to all Canadians, as hundreds of thousands of Canadians lined the highways and the overpasses, and as the trucks arrived in Ottawa, and as we spent 3 weeks in that cold Ottawa winter honking horns, we knew that we went back down, that we would stand our ground. And in the end, the government backed down and all COVID mandates came to an end. That is our history. And tonight we're going to retrace and retell some of these historic milestone events in our history that demonstrates Canadians have always been willing to fight for freedom. And as Wilfrid Laurier once said, Canadians are free and freedom is our nationality. He wasn't wrong and he wasn't mistaken. So tune on in. We'll be bringing a few other guests into the show, and I'm sure you're going to love tonight's show. Welcome to Canada, a user's guide and owner's manual. Many people want to fix this broken down machine called government. So join with me every week as we create an owner's manual to help people understand what these parts are, how they're supposed to fit together, and how to troubleshoot, maintain, and fix this broken down machine. In this week's episode of Canada, a user's guide and owner's manual, we ask the question, how did Canadians become free, and how did Canada gain its independence from an oppressive, authoritarian monarchy? Now, many Canadians understand how the Americans did it with the American Revolution, but don't have a great deal of knowledge or understanding of our rich and colorful history and the historical events that led to Canadians becoming free and an independent nation from Great Britain. We'll examine some of these great events, the Upper and Lower Canada rebellions, the conscription crisis, the Winnipeg General Strike, and many others to help us understand how our forefathers became free and became an independent nation with a representative democracy. If we want to fix our government today, we can learn a lot from how our ancestors acted in years gone by. Well, joining with me tonight is a good freedom fighter, good friend, Sean McCrae. He's been farming, his family's been farming in Glengarry County for nearly 200 years. Sean has been on many tractor protests with me and has blockaded a few government buildings in between with the Lanark landowners and our back off government. This land is our land protests and the rural revolution about 20 some years, near 25 years ago. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks, Randy. Got the sign here.
We still have those up as well. And also joining us tonight is a member of the newer generation of freedom fighters. Once again, Lee Stewie is joining me for the live stream, and Lee has been a strong advocate for freedom and in the independent news. And thank you very much for joining with us, Lee.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoy these shows that you have, and I think they're very educational and yeah. So before we jump right into it, I'm going to just do a bit of housekeeping in case you missed the first episode. I'm just going to let people know how this is going to work. So the last portion of the stream, Randy's going to be answering some of your questions that you have submitted to his website, randyhillier.com/ask-a-question. But if you didn't get a chance to ask a question before the stream, you can send in a super chat and we'll get to those at the last portion of the stream. And also, if you want to say hi to Randy in person, you can do so and get together with some like-minded people. There's going to be an event on November 3rd in Alexandria. It's a potluck dinner at 4 p.m. And then also November 9th with Maxime Bernier in Burlington. So that would probably be a good time as well. I mean, hey, there's food. You can't really go wrong, right?
Well, thank you very much, Lee. And also just make a note that it was wonderful to see so many people joining the stream tonight, again, from coast to coast. The names were popping up fairly quickly, and I didn't get to track them all, but thank you very much for joining us from coast to coast. So I wanted to just, before we get into some of these historic events, give a little bit of context, and maybe dispel some misunderstandings about our history. And so let's start with, Canada indeed was founded by European nations, but it wasn't really in the interest of their monarchs. It was more, Canada was really settled and explored by two companies, one French company called the Company of 100 Associates. And we'll know the name Samuel de Champlain. He was actually an investor in a company and also the chief administrator in Canada. The other company is the Hudson's Bay Company. We all have heard of that. But both these companies had exclusive monopoly rights and charters granted by the King of France and the King of England to exploit the resources of Canada and send the profits back to their rich shareholders in England and in France. And that really has been the origins and continues in large part to this day. The intertwining, and throughout our history, the intertwining between corporate interests and governments. So that's, and that corporate interests and their governance of Canada led to many disputes because obviously profits were more important than to those companies than democracy or freedoms. So some disputes were bound to occur, and they did. And many people will go through a few of these events, but the very first rebellion in Canada was in 1816 um, in what is now Manitoba. It's called the Victory at Frog Plain, and that was a dispute between the members of the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. But there's been many, many more. The Ballygiblin riots in 1823 to 1824 raged up and down the Ottawa Valley in that period of time. And then, of course, we come to the big one that very few Canadians know about, and that is the Upper and Lower Canada rebellions in between 1837 and 1839. And these rebellions was interesting because they were led by two elected members of the Upper and Lower Canada legislatures, Louis Joseph Papineau in what is now Quebec, and William Lyon Mackenzie in Upper Canada. Both were elected members. They had colorful histories as well, but they led many rebellions, and there was many battles that raged throughout Upper and Lower Canada through 1837 and 1839. Both Papineau and Mackenzie were exiled. Many of the participants were hung, and there was bloodshed throughout those rebellions. But and the last battles were in the winter of 1839, in the winter of 1839. And lo and behold, in 1840, the UK government, fearing that they would lose the Canadian colonies as they did with the American colonies, and as a result of those rebellions, brought in what was called the Durham Report and representative democracy for the first time, real democracy. And they reorganized the colonies into Canada East and Canada West. And for the first time, it was not the lieutenant governors and their appointed friends in the family compact in the Shadow Creek that were making the decisions for the people of Upper and Lower Canada. But now the cabinet and the executive were elected by the people. So a very short time, just a year after the rebellions, we got what is now called responsible government. Little known fact, but an important one.
So starting off, what made Mackenzie and Papineau start a rebellion?
Well, they both were they're both astute, knowledgeable businessmen and politicians. One was a newspaper publisher, Mackenzie. The other was a lawyer, and they were elected into those legislative assemblies. They saw the corruption that was going on. They saw that the people in the colonies were not being treated properly. They saw that the executive council, this family compact in Ontario and the Shadow Creek in Quebec, were ripping off the people. They were giving their friends and family members the choicest lands in the country. They were ensuring that lucrative patronage positions and government contracts were going to their friends and family members, where the poor farmers, and that's what it mostly was at the time, farmers, were getting to pay the bill, where the this corporate interest in this alignment with the family compact and Shadow Creek were deriving all the benefits. And they had spent many years before the rebellions. Did not just happen overnight. Both these individuals spent about 10 years petitioning the English government for improvements, for an elected cabinet, an elected executive, and all their overtures for responsible government were denied and dismissed. And of course, like we see today with lawfare today, Lee and Sean, the Shadow Creek and the family compact were not. They vandalized Mackenzie's printing presses and publishing houses. They used the mechanisms and the tools that were at their disposal to attack these two dissidents vigorously, just as we see it today. That governments don't like opposition, and they especially don't like effective opposition. So-
Randy, in a recent conversation that we had, tying that time to this time, you had mentioned that kids in school are not taught about what actually happened. I remember being in elementary school and being taught that it was a little brawl at the top end of Yonge Street, and so your contention is that it's a significant turning point in our history, politically, and that's not what I was told. So probably this current generation is probably not learning anything at all about it.
I'm sure of that. Yeah, that is one of the ways that they've downplayed these rebellions and their importance. Like you, I was told that there was a one-day brawl at Montgomery's Tavern in Toronto, and then the rebellion was over. Well, that's not quite true. There was important and significant battles in Windsor and Pelee Island and Sandwich. Down in that area, there was battles here in Eastern Ontario at the Battle of the Windmill, and many of these battles would have hundreds and hundreds of militants on each side, fighting for many days. The Battle of Châteauguay in Quebec was another very significant and important battle during the rebellions. It really is odd and well, despicable that we downplay our history in this regard. And we're very willing to promote the history of Canadians fighting overseas for freedom, but we're really hesitant. Not just hesitant. We refuse to be proud of or even acknowledge these important protests and rebellions here in our own country.
Well, there's something else significant there, I think, where I live, it's UEL country. It's probably one of the, I think we here in Glengarry County, we grow up boasting about having, the oldest churches and settlements and so on in the nation, apart from Quebec. So what you're talking about is a distinction between UELs that came up here, walked, tarred and feathered, the whole works after the American Revolution, and another wave of immigration that came after that. And it sounds to me like there's there's a distinction there. These rebellions were against the UEL establishment and probably infighting with those that came later. Am I wrong about that? Am I
Well,
understanding it correctly?
I think that's largely true. After the American War of Independence, many of the um, individuals who sided with the British Crown um, moved north to Canada. Many of these people sided with the British Crown because they were also the beneficiaries of the Crown. Many of them would have been the tax collectors and the port and harbor masters and postmasters, and that's and we know this is the way it is. People in their earnings and their livelihoods, that's going to have a bearing on and determine what they do. So the UEL came flooded into Canada. We call them the United Empire Loyalists. Now, they at the time that phrase hadn't been coined, but they largely became that family compact in that Shadow Creek. And they set up the same processes and mechanisms that they were benefiting from in the United States. And then as more and more immigrants came into Canada from an impoverished life in the Highlands of Scotland and from Ireland, these people were they were a second tier citizens, and that is that's pretty common throughout history as well. That if everybody is being treated equally and treated fairly, generally there's no reason for a rebellion. But more often than not, there's some group benefiting at the expense of another group, and that's I think that's largely an element that drove the rebellions of 1837 and 39. And this was in all these different fashions. The choicest properties, the Church of England got far more land than the Presbyterians, for example, or the Methodists and the Baptists, and that's and then they would, profit and benefit from those land transactions and many other corporate interests.
How
So
would we? Sorry,
how-
go ahead, Lee.
Is that how Mackenzie and Papineau would rally support in such a time where going against the Queen was pretty frowned upon? Because I understand the politician Howe out east was still very loyal to the Queen, but also did agree with what Mackenzie and Papineau were doing.
Yeah, I think from my reading of it, there was loyalty to the crown, to a large degree. By they did not necessarily want all their petitions were not for a disassociation from the crown, but for representative democracy and an end to this family compact business. So, and at the time, most of the people in Upper and Lower Canada were farmers, and many of them had been former military people as well. Many of them were recently discharged from the English armies after the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. So these, and then there was many others who were here a little earlier. The fur traders, the trappers, and the loggers. Like, we're dealing with some pretty tough individuals. These were not slouches and pansies by any means, and they were offered to come to Canada to improve their lives, and then to see um, that others were taking advantage and that they were second class. I don't think it took very long. Well, we know it didn't take very long to mobilize opposition. It took a few years. But another interesting element of that, Lee, is that I can't count. Mackenzie was turfed from the Upper Canada um, uh, legislature many times. The family compact really
As were
didn't like
you, Randy. Sorry.
him. But they kicked him out many times, and he also became mayor of Toronto. And no matter what they did, he had so much popular support. He kept getting elected, and the same with Papineau. So that tells us that there was a great sentiment amongst the population that these two fellas and others were standing up for them and standing against this authoritarian and oppressive and profitable arrangement between the family compact and these companies and their families and friends. So, but they didn't. That's what it looks like to me. Um, they did not want to separate from Great Britain or secede as the Americans did, but still the British Crown and the UK Parliament would have none of their reasonable requests until push came to shove. Much again like what we saw during COVID. The governments weren't going to back down until Canadians showed them that they were going to stand up.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next, Randy, is how to tie that piece of history into our current situation here in Canada. I've been reading about a little bit of skullduggery going on in British Columbia right now with the current election, and we know also that the federal government under Justin Trudeau has increased the federal bureaucracy by well, it's been a couple of years since he increased it by 40%, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's up by 50% now. Do we still have that family compact problem relative to those of us who work for a living and struggle hard to pay our taxes?
Well, I think we do. I think it's obvious we do. It comes in a different name now, but let's just go back because this was the real trigger that launched the rebellions, like the straw that broke the camel's back was the elections of 1836. And there was all kinds of jiggery pokery and election rigging in that election. And for people to, this many people may not know, but at that time, the idea of a secret ballot had not been implemented.
I
You
remember
had to-
that. Yes.
You
Well,
had
I
to go into
wasn't
the
there, but I
town
remember
square.
reading about it. Yeah.
Yeah, you had to go
Put your
into the
hand
town
up or something.
square and
Yeah.
declare who your vote was for, and
Mm.
and of course, different political teams would have their own thugs and mob and enforcers there, and if they didn't like the way you voted, you might get a nice beating after your declaration.
Right.
And that was one of the things that Papineau and Mackenzie had been demanding. They were part of a group called in Quebec it was called the Patriots. In Upper Canada it was called the Reformers. They were demanding for secret ballots and a number of other things. Papineau had actually gone to England with 92 resolutions to ensure fair and free elections, and they were all rejected. But the election rigging of 1836 was the straw that broke the camel's back, and today, the group that we would say that that shadow clique in that family compact, today we would call them here in Canada the Laurentian elite, or the Central Canada elite, or we would call them globalists. That's the same sort of parallel that you would make between 200 years after our major rebellions, Laurentian elites and globalists.
Well, how about the way our electorate is divided over the country? You talk to an Albertan, they're not going to feel like they're getting their fair share of representation federally, and Quebec has perhaps an unfair advantage when it comes to how many seats they have in the House, relative to an Albertan's contribution to national GDP, or Ontario too. I think we've got this immigration issue, and it's in the press quite a bit. How are those numbers being apportioned according to these old ideas of proportional representation?
Well, I think there's, whenever there is conflict, whenever there's, as I said earlier, if people are not feeling that they're being treated fairly, or that there are some people gaining an advantage that the government or the authorities or the powers to be are favoring one group over another, that is obviously a recipe for, first off, conflict and disputes. And if it gets amplified, or if it doesn't get resolved, eventually it will resolve in or result in further protests and escalate to rebellions. But I think we'll get into the current stuff a little bit later, because I think we can draw parallels through a number of these historical events with what's happening in Canada today.
Okay.
So earlier on,
ahead.
you mentioned about the rebellion of the Upper and Lower Canada kind of being downplayed in schools, and that the rebellion wasn't successful. Were they successful, and what can we take away from their bravery to act against the corporate government?
Oh, the rebellions were absolutely successful. As I said, within a year of the end of the battles, or the end of the rebellions, Lord Durham was commissioned, sent over from the UK to speak with the people here, and to find a resolution, because I think the powers be in the UK knew that if they did not do something soon, it was in very, very likelihood that the Canadian colonies would have their own war of independence. So immediately, Durham took a very short period of time to issue his report. He even traveled to the United States to meet with Mackenzie, and to get Mackenzie's view. He was in exile at the time, and he met with Papineau, and within that year they abolished the colonial administrations of Upper and Lower Canada, created Canada East and Canada West with a single parliament, and they also removed the appointed executive councils in each of the colonies, and went to an elected cabinets for the very first time. So, like, that's a pretty big milestone, a pretty big step, and it happened in 1 year, within 1 year of the rebellions. So, to suggest that these things were not important or not successful is an absolute falsehood, and goes against the grain of facts and truth. And of course, if that step hadn't been taken, that was a necessary step, because not long after, of course, we would have all the these former colonies, confederate together in the formation of Canada with its own. Well, it was a nascent, but it was still with its first own British North America Act, which served as a constitution and began the complete removal of the Great Britain from the affairs of Canada. So that's it. Really is what they're teaching our kids in public education is more false than true, in my view.
So do you think that people in Canada are more willing to fight in a war on behalf of government? And this kind of goes with the conscription crisis. If Canadians are more willing to fight in a war on behalf of their government or in a war against their government?
Well, we've had a lot more wars against our government than we've gone overseas. And again, that is something most Canadians would not have any knowledge about. And if they heard it for the first time, might think that we're telling tall tales here at the Lodge. But it's true. We've had far more military engagements in Canada than we have had overseas. But, again, this goes, the conscription crisis is another really, really great example of Canadians fighting for their individual freedoms and the culture of Canadians. In Canada in 1917, the government called for conscription in the First World War. Up until that time, it had been strictly a volunteer army. And in 1917, they said, no, now we have to start conscripting and issued a draft. There was a huge pushback from that initiative. Sir Robert Borden was the prime minister of the day. And the protests that ensued, Borden had to call out the military to end the protests over conscription, and that's this didn't happen in the United States. There was conscription in the United States, and they've had conscription much more often than we ever have. They've been, but an interesting element of that story is once those violent protests over conscription in the First World War happened, the conscription crisis raised its head again in the Second World War. And now, in the Second World War, we have the grandson of William Lyon Mackenzie is now the the prime minister of this country, Mackenzie King, and he sees this trouble brewing as well, that the UK government and the Allies are demanding ever more soldiers to be shipped overseas. And Mackenzie King was I think it was in his blood as well, this recognition of freedom, being the grandson of William Lyon Mackenzie. And he came up with one of the most craftiest and most unintelligible slogans, political slogans in Canadian history. And he said, conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. And at the end of the day, he was able to, he came up with a policy that you could be drafted into the army, but you could not be sent overseas without your free and informed consent. So he realized that, and I think he recognized that he learned a good lesson from the first conscription crisis. He knew that Canadians meant what they said, and didn't want to have another violent period of violence at home. So he managed to thread the needle and compromise. Canadians were drafted. But they didn't have to go overseas. So that, I'm not sure if we lost that stream or not, but anyway, that's and that follows up again. These were the last times that the last time that I'm aware of. Well, maybe one of the last times. We also had the Winnipeg General Strike, where Canadians were protesting against our governments and the corporate interests who were aligned at the time, that were preventing unions and preventing collective bargaining rights. And in Winnipeg, we had a full-on general strike for a period of weeks. And again, the government called out the military to squash that protest. But once again, the protests were successful, and collective bargaining and unions were recognized by everybody during those protests. So I think Canadians are willing to fight overseas if they believe that there's value and importance to it. But it doesn't look like they want to be told they have to go overseas, and but I think it's also important to recognize that when it comes to freedom, our history shows that Canadians take it seriously and are willing to fight for it.
I got another question for you, Randy.
Sure.
Sometimes you and I meet up at the courthouse in Ottawa.
Yes.
To defend your individual freedom. And last summer, on my way to one of those meetings, I walked the wrong way, and I came across this statue dedicated to government snipers that served at the Battle of Cut Bank. Did you have that on your list of? I think it was Cut Bank. I think it was in Saskatchewan, if I'm not mistaken.
Not sure of that one, but that sounds like, because there's so many battles. We as Canadians, we don't even have a good history of the campaigns or the major events, but we had the Red River Rebellion in 1870, which led to the creation of Manitoba, and there was a number of battles in that uprising. We had the Northwest Rebellion which would lead to the creation of Saskatchewan and Alberta. Um, and there was that was a significant one. There was many battles in that rebellion. The Battle of Batoche was one of the biggest one, and again, we're talking about battles with hundreds and hundreds of armed individuals on each side and more. Um, and those were again all led to the creation of the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. But once again, it was, in the Red River uprising, it was the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company owned all the land. They were making the decisions. There were farmers, fur traders, etc. And they wanted a piece of the land as well. And that was one of the direct outcomes of the Red River uprising was 200,000 acres were ceded from the Hudson Bay Company for the creation of Manitoba, an allotment to the people who lived there. Again, the corporate interests, in this case, the Hudson Bay Company, they're there to make a profit, not there to make sure that somebody has freedom and a protest and a rebellion and an uprising occurred, and land was taken from that corporation, that exclusive monopoly, and a new province was formed. But I don't know that battle.
Okay, I'll do a little more research on that, but I have a picture on my phone somewhere of that statue. So you're talking about Prince Rupert.
Just before you go there, there is. It is interesting if you go. There's many different statues, plaques, etc. around the country now. They're there right at the moment. If the woke hear about this, they'll probably be all torn down as well. They have with Edgerton Ryerson and Sir John A. and whatnot. But statues of William Lyon Mackenzie at the legislative building. Like, although we don't talk about it in our education, like they knew they had to recognize the achievements of these people. The homes of Papineau are national historic sites. One of them that you're probably aware of, but might not be aware. Chateau Montebello was Papineau's original farm, and that's for people from farther out. Might not know that name, but it's on the Ottawa River, not far from Ottawa. And Lee, you may know that one from that just prior to the G20 protests in Toronto, that big schmozzle back in 2010, I think it was, or just before that, they had the G7 summit at Chateau Montebello.
I was there. Yep.
Were you at Montebello as well?
Well, no, I've seen it though when I was there for the G7, and that's when they caught the undercover police officers. But yeah,
you know what? I had forgotten that, but there was that's right. There was a number of undercover cops that were caught and revealed. Unfortunately, we didn't reveal any of them that were in Ottawa in February 2022, but we know they were there as well.
So what do you think the goal is of the government to convince Canadians that we're just like peacekeeping, docile, not rebellious whatsoever?
Well, I think, it's control. Listen, we, as much as we want to believe that we live in a free and representative democratic country, and there are elements of truth to that, I think it would be, you'd have to be living in fairyland to believe that our system is not being corrupted and has been corrupted for some time. And control is very important in a predatory system that we have. We saw that during COVID very much, controlling people with fear to extract and exploit as much money from the public purse for the powers to be, and and it wasn't just Pfizer, and it wasn't just Moderna that made off like bandits during COVID. There was a great many corporate interests aligned with the entrenched bureaucracy and with the political parties that made off very handsomely. And listen, we even saw one of the Liberal cabinet ministers, Randy Boissonnault, got caught up. His healthcare business that was receiving huge contracts during COVID, and he was a minister in the Trudeau cabinet. So, and still is. So this is in a predatory system. You want to have control over people, and you certainly don't. You want to, and I think we did this. The government did it very effectively during COVID, but for a while, it convinced Canadians that there was nothing that they could do about it. That they were too passive, too obedient, and you just had to be a victim, and that was the best thing that you could do or be during COVID. From the COVID message, just be afraid, stay in your house, don't meet with your friends, don't have your family over for Christmas or Thanksgiving, don't open up your business, just suck it up, buttercup, and be steamrolled while we steal all the money and load up your children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren with debts that could never be paid back as they make it off to the bank. So,
can I add to that a little bit, Randy?
Yeah.
So you touched on fear mongering, and also, we saw censorship, so that people were not being informed. It was not impossible, but it was difficult to get accurate information about what was happening in the scientific community, and doctors were being sidelined and having their credentials stomped on, and licenses removed, and so on. So there were a host of strategies that were used to prevent the populace from becoming informed and knowledgeable about what was happening. Was that some kind of accident of the time, or was that strategic?
No, that is, and we've come to learn that the our military was engaged in a PSYOP program. David Puglisi from the Ottawa Citizen has written about that, and I don't know if you've been following that story, but he's been a long time writer for the investigative reporter for the National Post chain, and he was writing about this, and now the Chris Alexander, a former cabinet minister in the Harper cabinet and a former ambassador for Canada, and I would say part of that Laurentian elite, has called out that David Puglisi is a Russian agent for putting this story out, and other stories. So anybody who opposes or dissents is going to be targeted. We've also seen from the congressional hearings in the states that the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI were actually employed in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Google, and they had bolos out, like be on the lookout for people who they knew were opposing COVID. But again, governments have always done this. When we started off this show, we talked about how they broke up William Lyon Mackenzie's publishing house and newspaper business,
Right.
broke his printing presses. He was saying things that the government didn't want to be talked about. So censorship is nothing new. The tactics are somewhat different. The technologies are different, but governments will go to great lengths. All governments will go to great lengths to spin, craft, censor. But I just saw a note that came up on screen, and that is from Dave, and I think that is an important thing to mention. Both the Winnipeg General Strike and the conscription crisis were all peaceful protests until the government moved in and started the violence.
Yes.
The same thing that happened in Ottawa. There was no everybody was exuberant, exhilarated, friendly, joyful, with bouncy castles and road hockey games. And it wasn't until the government moved in was the first sign of violence. And again, still Canadians stood their ground. There was people were injured. We saw at least 2 people trampled. One, we don't know who that second person is. We did find out about the one lady who was trampled by the horses. I'm pretty confident in saying, just as a side note, that I think that other person who was trampled, that we never got their name, I think he was an undercover cop in the protests, and that's why we've never heard anything else about him. But that's just speculation on my part, and don't have any evidence. But it is an odd thing that 2 people get trampled by a mounted police unit, but only one person gets identified. So
well, and there were independent journalists struck with canisters of tear gas and batons and so on. It was a pretty brutal day, and the truckers that had their trucks smashed and towed off, even when no heavy tow truck company was willing to help. What a time.
Yeah.
So social media is kind of like a double-edged sword. It can be used to our benefit, but do you think that social media is sort of like used as a pressure release valve to kind of keep people from revolting, so like they can just air out their grievances on social media, so therefore they're less likely to rebel against the government?
I think the government has got their fingers so deep into social media now, Lee. Truly, I don't think, we just saw recently France arrest Pavel, the owner of Telegram. And we've seen Zuckerberg come out from Facebook saying how he regrets how much involvement he allowed CIA and Homeland Security involvement in Facebook and Instagram. I think our governments like social media in one regard, and that is that it can be it is often a form to promote division and animosity, and also to keep people at each other's throats and distracted. There's that element of it. But we've also seen especially the American government, utilize social media for their ends in these color revolutions, like what had happened in Ukraine in 2014, and in the Arab Spring. There's ample evidence now that social media was used very effectively by the intelligence agencies, and to get rid of the governments that they wanted to get rid of in those countries. And we also have seen that they were very, very effective in not just the censorship, but the corollary of that censorship is the belief that the message that was being promoted was the only good and the only true message. As Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand said, the only truth you're going to hear is from the government. So those are all aspects of it, but I think it is also used by government and promoted as such as a means to keep people distracted, occupied, and sitting in front of a screen instead of being out meeting with other like-minded people and actually mobilizing and encouraging and motivating opposition to government. I think it's an element of social media really plays into the be a victim. The only thing that you can do is hit the retweet button, and that's the extent of your warrior spirit and warrior culture that they are so damn determined to make sure that they try to extinguish in this country.
So where do you see Canada going? And do you think that we have another rebellion in us?
Well, I think we've been in the midst of a rebellion of some sort, for a period of time. I think we're in a period of reform, and many, this was one of the great benefits of COVID, Lee. I think everybody can see this, and I'll share from my story. For 15 years, I ranted and raved about the corruption in politics in Ontario, and you could hardly ever get anyone to be motivated. They always thought that these corruption scandals, well, that's just one off, or that's just because it's the Liberals in power, or that's just because it's the Conservatives in power. But I think COVID really opened the eyes up to so many people that we do have a very corrupt political machine in this country, that we have a very predatory political system in our country, and people are shifting their behaviors, shifting their actions, and many freedom groups are meeting, small freedom groups meeting weekly and consistently throughout the country, and shifting their many people are leaving the cities and changing their lifestyles and meeting other like-minded people. So I think there is a rebellion underway right at the moment. Not a um, not a rebellion in the typical sense, but or maybe it's better to say a revolution is underway. That many Canadians are seeing that they have to do things differently, and are, um, uh, we're seeing a great shift in uh, many people growing their own food, becoming more self-sufficient. Um, so, and also getting away from the traps of government, the traps of convenience, and that are coming at us, like central bank digital currencies and 15-minute cities. So I think um, we're in that revolutionary stage. Um, uh, and I think we've shown once again that uh, peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience, uh, government should recognize that and the importance of it. And uh, um, if they don't take up that seriously, if they act like the family compact in 1836 and figure that they can keep rigging elections and rigging the nomination processes uh, and doing people poorly, um, they could be in a much um, it could be the dynamics can change. And listen, we've seen this. This is not just a um, something that's happening in Canada. Um, Look at the south of the border. Um, how uh, you know I think the evidence is pretty clear that there was substantial vote tampering and election tampering in 2020. Um, they were, what we saw just a few months ago with the the American Family Compact, the Democrat Party. Removed their candidate without any process, and they installed a new candidate without any process.
Yeah.
And like and just for the first time in my lifetime, not one but two assassination attempts on a candidate for president within weeks of one another.
Yeah.
And um, the roof was too sloped to protect the former president. So listen, there's
Nice photo.
where's it going to end? Well, it's as I've often said, governments will governments will learn a lesson. Um, they're either going to learn a good lesson or they're going to learn a bad lesson. Um, yeah, I don't know which one they've learned yet, um, uh, uh, but I don't. I think they're going to have to learn another lesson yet before we get anywhere close to um, a free, fair, just democracy in this country, and begin to limit the um, the corruption within this predatory system.
You and Lee have both made good points. I think that there is a temptation, born perhaps of laziness, to just be a keyboard warrior, and take out your frustrations in that echo chamber that somebody on the chat mentioned. Um, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. However, um, I think it can't be ignored either that social media represents um, a much more diverse cornucopia of information that it's up to the individual citizen to process it. I remember being a teenager, and at 6 o'clock we ate supper at the kitchen table, and Max Keeping told us the news, what was going on at Parliament Hill, what was going on around the world, and so on. And that's totally different anymore. And it's true that we're geared to probably follow the sites that we prefer. That echo chamber where we shy away from political opinions we don't agree with, and we gravitate toward the ones that we do. But at the same time, it's all accessible, as long as we don't allow government, which it's trying to do right now, to interfere with our access to that information.
Well, there's no question the the Canadian media now are on a government lifeline. The mainstream media would not exist without it's not just the direct subsidies that Trudeau announced. It's also the governments are the main source of ad revenue for many of our mainstream media. It's and also the CRTC and the ability for government to regulate or remove licenses on the airwaves or radio stations. These are all threats. So the media has become beholden to the federal government. They're no different, in my view, than the former USSR state media, Pravda and TASS. And clearly, we've also seen, as the mainstream media's influence has waned and the audience levels have declined, more and more people are seeking other venues to find information. And and again, many of us still have to be cautious about what we say on social media, because we'll be deplatformed, and many have. But most of us, I think, are learning what we can say, or finding those other platforms where there's a far greater latitude on them, like Rumble and others. So I think that's I believe the influence of the mainstream media will continue to wane. The influence of the alternative media and other hosts, whether it's Rogan or Tucker or all these great podcasters, are putting out some really significant content, and that's why we're learning these things, that what has happened with the CIA, the Homeland Security, FBI's involvement in media. Like, there's that great fella Mike Benz has done a great job revealing how the deep state is deeply entrenched into the internet and into the media. So those are all good elements, but we'll see. We've got some big events will be happening. I understand there's a little election down in south of the border in a few more days. That's going to be interesting.
Yep.
And and we didn't. The Conservatives didn't win. We finally had a premier. This is important, and it's I'm often very critical of Conservatives, especially. Well, I'm just critical of all political parties, but we did see an interesting thing in BC. We had a leader of the BC Conservative Party actually speaking truthfully about vaccines and COVID. He may not have gone the complete distance, but he did really good, in my view, and came up a couple seats short from the looks of it. But that's a good sign, because that's really, in my view, the first candidate for premier of a province that has been speaking truthfully about what happened during COVID. So that's a good sign.
It's important to keep the pressure on, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've reached the question period portion of the stream. We're in the last few minutes here. And so if you have a super chat, I suggest sending it in sending it in now. So yeah, we have a couple of questions from the website, which is randyhillier.com/ask-a-question. And it looks like Willow asked a question, and it pertains to the last stream where we were talking about bills and the process of how a bill is passed. So Willow asks, can the Senate stop a bill?
Well, yes, they can. The Senate, every bill that in the federal parliament must receive Senate approval as well, and there are 3 readings. Now, I'll say it's not very often the Senate will stop a bill, but we have seen the Senate in the past makes major amendments to a government bill that significantly waters it down or stunts its.
It's supposed to be the chamber of sober second thought, is it not, Randy?
Well, that is a term that they use, but I'm not sure how sober. But there is a second thought. But it's you wouldn't want the Senate impeding an elected body, or no, you wouldn't want them to prevent an elected body, but you do want them to impede and do their job of their regional representation. And hopefully, I think there's an important one, an important bill in the Senate right at the moment, Bill 293. I'm not sure exactly what, if any, the Senate is contemplating on amendments or changes to that, but that's a good place to apply some pressure.
That's a doozy.
293. Yeah.
All right. So the next question comes from Lynn. Lynn asks, how strong do you think our Constitution is? And is there any teeth to it? Is there any teeth at all to our freedom of rights? Brian Peckford suggests no to both. Could you invite Brian on the show as part of the discussion? We will send the link to him as well. Does the Constitution or Charter of Rights and Freedoms protect us personal and national sovereignty against foreign intrusion as proposed in Bill C-293? Great question.
So let's do the first part. I believe our Charter of Rights is fairly good. It does offer protection where it has fallen down. I think when it was written in 1982, it was a good document. Where we've fallen down is that the integrity of the people upholding the laws are where it's really fallen down. So the great mass of judges who have come out of the woke liberal arts academia, and same with a great many of the elected representatives, politicians coming out of woke left academia, And I think also just the overall um, diminished level of integrity in our system is a bigger problem than the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and same with the Constitution. Um, and
Right.
I've often said this: a law is just a piece of paper. The only strength or the only value that that law has will ever be found in the integrity of the people who are upholding it. So, uh, and as we've seen so far, um, there's been a significant lack of integrity in upholding the spirit of and the language of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But for the last part of that, I have talked to Brian Peckford, and he has agreed to come on the show to talk about. Although we have a slightly different view, I think it'll be an interesting show to have Brian on the show and talking about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution. So stay
That
tuned.
is going to be awesome. That's going to be an awesome one. Last but not least, Laureen asks, how can Canada be changed from the British parliamentary system to a republic? Is it simply a matter of a slow creep towards every institution becoming corrupted that we see law enforcement, judiciary, and other working to prop up a criminal government, or is there something more complex at play?
Okay, let's start with the first one. We cannot. Our Constitution says that we will have a parliamentary system of government like Westminster in the UK. So there is. Well, let's be honest. The only way that that is going to change from our parliamentary system, in all likelihood, would be through a very significant revolution. Um, none of the none of our provincial premiers, or the likelihood of any provincial premier and the prime minister wanting to change that system. That's politicians don't do things like that. They do things that benefit them, not so that won't happen unless there was indeed a revolution, in my view. And but I don't think that is. Also, I might add that it's not that our system, the design of the system, that is causing the problems in our country. It's much bigger than that, in my view.
Can I add something real quick, Randy?
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes is an American. He was a judge and judicial scholar, learned hand. And he said, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. The spirit of liberty is in the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias." So essentially, the Constitution works so long as we recognize it, both as individuals and as court systems and as politicians. But if we choose to ignore it, then it's not going to work at all.
Well, it's exactly the same as our own individual freedoms. The You have to, your freedoms will not exist if you're not willing to defend them.
Right.
That's the way it is.
Mhm.
There is a term or an adage, that freedoms can never be taken away. They can only ever be surrendered. And I think that's true. It's so all those things are, um, I believe, axioms, and um, if you want to have freedom, you're going to have to defend it. If you want to have good laws, um, you'll have to uphold those good laws.
I think I saw someone in the chat go all the way back to Roman times.
Yeah.
Um, it's not a new thing. So
No. What was that second part of that question, Lee? Oh, here it is. Um,
Is it a matter of a slow creep towards every institution becoming corrupted that we see law enforcement, judiciary, and others working to prop up a criminal government, or is it something more complex at play?
good question.
well, I think that the very first part of that is very true. It has been a very slow incremental creep, and it has infected. It's been a cancer that has infected every institution. And it's not just the big institutions as is in that question, like law enforcement and judiciary. Look at our library boards having drag queen shows for little kids. Every institution has become corrupted. With our hospital boards who wouldn't allow and won't allow people to receive a transplant if they've not been vaccinated. It's all manner of every institution in our country, and this has been going on for a long time. I think, um, as we have um, diminished, or as we have um, grown in our affluence over time, um, I think and another element that we've seen happen is that we've um, rejected a fixed moral code, and we have adopted a very moral relativism. Uh, and where everything becomes a little bit more wishy-washy, and in fact we're now at the point where there is in many aspects no moral code. Here we see uh, uh, men, and mostly men, hanging out with hanging out at pride parades, and there was one down in Sydney or Brisbane, Australia, on the weekend. I saw that this was a form of art where over 5,000 people stripped naked to walk on a bridge, and this was some form of modern art. We have these medical, our medical institutions and psychiatric institutions have now made it that if somebody is confused about their gender, you must affirm, um, and if and end up mutilating their body parts. So yeah, um, it's been a slow creep, but I think we're really not going to go too much more deeper because our society is not going to function, uh, and it can't function as it is already. We are starting to see significant psychological damaged people, um, and uh, yeah, yes, make asylums great again.
Well, we've reached the end of the stream here. If there's any last words from either of you, I just want to say thanks to the chat for showing up and supporting this awesome show, and thank you, Randy, for being so informative. And I always learn a lot from these shows, believe it or not. Being involved in politics as long as I have been, exposing the government. I never really did take the time to look into our past and kind of have a refresher course
Yeah.
And this show makes me now want to go visit those places like Montgomery Inn in Toronto and go see what it looks like. And so, yeah, I just want to thank everyone, especially the chat, for showing up. And thank you, Randy.
Well, thank you all for being here. I've had a wonderful time, and and I do think Canada's history is really, really it's good. You learn a lot from it, and you can see what it helps show you where we're going, or what may prevail. I'm not sure. Are we? And I guess I should say next week we've got another episode. This one will be about how our political parties create the illusion of choice in elections, and how they rig the nomination processes, and how the leadership races are rigged.
The party system.
So that the family compact is sure to have their whoever you choose, it will still be a member of the family compact or the Chateau clique in today's Canada. So
where did you get all that cynicism, Randy?
just from 15 years of watching inside and seeing how political parties actually operate. I think I can say, I can understand why very few political people, when they retire, speak ill of politics, because they if they spoke truthfully about politics, they would expose their entire careers as a falsehood. So, do we have a video to show, a little promo video for next week's rigging the elections and the illusion of democracy? And hopefully everybody enjoy. Thank you very much for joining with me, Sean, Lee, and
thank you, Randy. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
And next week, 8 p.m. And somebody corrected me. It's Eastern Daylight Time. I put Eastern Standard Time. So 8 p.m. Eastern next week. We'll see you again. Thanks.
See you then. Thank you.
Welcome to Canada, a user's guide and owner's manual. Many people want to fix this broken down machine called government. So join with me every week as we create an owner's manual to help people understand what these parts are, how they're supposed to fit together, and how to troubleshoot, maintain, and fix this broken down machine. Welcome to another edition of Canada, a user's guide and owner's manual. In this week's episode, we're going to examine how our established political parties have hijacked our system and create the illusion of choice on election day for Canadian voters. And they do this by rigging the nomination process. I'll share with you some of my personal experiences and observations on how the local nominations are rigged, but also how the leadership races are rigged to make sure that the choices you're given on election day, those nominees will have loyalty and allegiance to the political party, not to you, the voter. So join with me as we not only explore this subject, but also how we can fix and repair this broken aspect of our democracy.